Welcome to Icons of History, where we uncover the extraordinary lives that shaped our world. Today, we journey into the remarkable story of Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, a man whose very name has become synonymous with courage, defiance, and unwavering determination. But behind the iconic image of the wartime prime minister lies a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy, brilliance and controversy that few truly understand. From his troubled childhood in the corridors of aristocratic power to his darkest hours battling what he called his black dog of depression, Churchill's life was a constant struggle between greatness and personal demons. We'll explore the shocking failures that nearly destroyed his career, the controversial decisions that haunt his legacy, and the extraordinary transformation that turned a political outcast into the voice of freedom itself. This is not just the story of a leader, but of a deeply flawed human being who rose to meet history's greatest challenge when civilization itself hung in the balance. The making of a complex soul. On a bitterly cold November morning in 1874, in a lady's cloakroom at Blenheim Palace, Jenny Jerome Churchill gave birth prematurely to a son who would one day save the free world. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill entered this world 2 months early, as if even then he was impatient to begin his extraordinary journey. The circumstances of his birth were telling. His American mother had been dancing at a ball when labor began, and there was no time to reach a proper birthing room. From his very first breath, Winston Churchill was destined to be unconventional. Blenheim Palace, the magnificent Baroque masterpiece gifted to his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, should have been a paradise for any child. With its 187 rooms, sprawling gardens, and priceless art collections, it represented the pinnacle of British aristocratic privilege. Yet for young Winston, these golden halls became a prison of loneliness and neglect. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising star in conservative politics, brilliant but erratic, consumed by ambition and increasingly distant from his family. His mother, the beautiful and vivacious Jenny, was a force of nature who captivated London society but had little time for motherhood. The emotional abandonment Winston experienced was profound and lasting. His parents viewed him as an inconvenience, shipping him off to boarding school at the tender age of 7. At St. George's School in Ascot, the sensitive boy encountered a regime of brutal discipline that would traumatize him for life. The headmaster, Herbert Snade Kinnersley, was a sadist who took pleasure in beating his young charges with birch rods until they bled. Winston, rebellious and defiant even as a child, became a frequent target. Years later, he would write that he was flogged for things I had not done, and flogged for things I could not have done, and flogged for things I ought not to have done. The psychological scars ran deep. Winston developed a stutter that would plague him throughout his life, and he began to exhibit signs of what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety. His academic performance was dismal. He was placed in the lowest form and struggled with Latin, mathematics, and classical studies. Yet even in these dark early years, flashes of his future brilliance emerged. His English essays were extraordinary, filled with vivid imagery and powerful rhetoric that amazed his teachers. He possessed an almost photographic memory for poetry and literature, able to recite thousands of lines of verse from memory. The relationship with his parents remained painfully distant. Lord Randolph saw his son as a disappointment, once writing to Winston's headmaster that the boy was a troublesome fellow who would degenerate into a shabby, unhappy, and futile existence. These words cut deep into Winston's soul, creating a lifelong need to prove himself worthy of his father's love and respect. Jenny, meanwhile, was often absent, pursuing her own interests and rumored affairs with prominent men of the day, including allegedly the Prince of Wales himself. Winston found solace in his vast collection of toy soldiers, over 1,500 meticulously arranged figures that he would deploy in elaborate military campaigns across the nursery floor. This childhood obsession with warfare and strategy would prove prophetic, as would his voracious appetite for adventure stories and tales of military heroism. He devoured the works of writers like G.A. Henty and dreamed of glory on distant battlefields. At Harrow School, where he was sent at age 13, Winston's rebellious nature continued to clash with authority. He was frequently caned for various infractions, yet he also began to show signs of the leadership qualities that would define his later life. He excelled in history and English, winning prizes for his essays and developing the oratorical skills that would one day inspire a nation. His housemaster noted that while Winston was troublesome, he possessed an extraordinary force of character and an unusual power of expression. The death of his beloved nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, when Winston was 20, devastated him more than the loss of either parent would. She had been the only constant source of love and affection in his childhood, and he would later write that she had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. Her passing marked the end of his youth and the beginning of his desperate quest to make his mark upon the world. As Winston Churchill emerged from the shadows of his troubled youth, the late Victorian era was witnessing unprecedented change. The British Empire stretched across the globe, encompassing a quarter of the world's population. Yet beneath the surface of this imperial grandeur, social and political tensions were mounting. Into this world of transformation stepped a young man burning with ambition and haunted by the need to prove himself worthy of his illustrious lineage. Churchill's entry into the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1893 marked a turning point in his development. Here, finally, was an environment where his natural leadership abilities and strategic mind could flourish. He threw himself into military studies with unprecedented enthusiasm, graduating 8th in a class of 150, a remarkable achievement for someone who had struggled academically throughout his school years. His instructors noted his exceptional grasp of military tactics and his ability to inspire confidence in his fellow cadets. Upon graduation, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, one of the most prestigious cavalry regiments in the British Army. The young officer cut a dashing figure in his scarlet uniform, but beneath the glamorous exterior lay a calculating mind, already plotting his path to greatness. Churchill understood that in the rigid class structure of Victorian Britain, military glory was one of the few ways a younger son could achieve the fame and recognition he desperately craved. His first taste of combat came in 1895 when he managed to attach himself as an observer to Spanish forces fighting Cuban rebels. At just 20 years old, Churchill displayed the courage and reckless disregard for personal safety that would characterize his entire life. Under heavy fire from rebel positions, he calmly took notes and sketched maps, seemingly oblivious to the bullets whistling around him. This experience taught him a crucial lesson. Danger and publicity were often synonymous, and both could be leveraged for personal advancement. Returning to England, Churchill chafed at the peacetime routine of military life. His regiment was stationed in India, and he used this posting to maximum advantage, not only serving as a soldier, but also working as a war correspondent for several London newspapers. His dispatches from the northwest frontier, where British forces were engaged in constant skirmishes with Pathan tribesmen, revealed a writer of exceptional talent. His prose was vivid and dramatic, bringing the harsh realities of frontier warfare to life for readers back home. It was during this period that Churchill began to develop his complex and often contradictory views on empire and race. He genuinely believed in the civilizing mission of the British Empire, yet he also displayed a troubling tendency toward racial stereotyping that reflected the prejudices of his time and class. His descriptions of the Pathan warriors, while respectful of their fighting abilities, were tinged with the casual racism that characterized much Victorian writing about non-European peoples. The young Churchill's hunger for action led him to the Sudan in 1898, where he participated in the Battle of Omdurman as part of Kitchener's campaign to reconquer the territory. This experience provided material for his first book, The River War, a 2-volume account that established his reputation as both a military historian and a gifted writer. The work displayed his remarkable ability to combine personal narrative with broader strategic analysis, a skill that would serve him well in his later political career. But it was during the Second Boer War that Churchill truly made his name. Serving as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, he was captured by Boer forces while aboard an armored train that came under attack. His subsequent escape from a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria became the stuff of legend. For 25 days, he evaded capture while making his way through enemy territory to Portuguese East Africa, a journey of over 300 miles. The story captivated the British public and transformed Churchill from an ambitious young officer into a national hero. The escape revealed key aspects of Churchill's character that would define his entire career. His willingness to take enormous risks, his ability to think quickly under pressure, and his talent for self-promotion all played crucial roles in his success. Yet the episode also highlighted his capacity for embellishment and his tendency to place personal advancement above other considerations. Some of his fellow prisoners felt he had broken his word by escaping, and questions were raised about whether he had abandoned his companions to save himself. Upon his return to England in 1900, Churchill leveraged his newfound fame into a political career. His speeches on the lecture circuit drew enormous crowds, and his books about his military experiences became bestsellers. He had successfully transformed himself from a struggling young officer into a public figure of considerable renown. Yet beneath the confident exterior, the insecurities and emotional wounds of his childhood remained. His desperate need for approval and recognition would drive him to ever greater heights of achievement, but it would also lead him into some of the darkest chapters of his career. The foundation had been laid for one of the most remarkable political careers in British history. Churchill had learned to harness his natural talents, his gift for language, his strategic mind, his physical courage, and his ability to inspire others in service of his burning ambition. But he had also developed some of the character flaws that would nearly destroy him: his impulsiveness, his tendency toward grandiose schemes, and his difficulty in accepting criticism or admitting error. The ascent to power. The dawn of the 20th century found Winston Churchill poised on the threshold of political greatness, yet the path ahead would prove far more treacherous than he could have imagined. His entry into Parliament in 1900 as the Conservative member for Oldham marked the beginning of a political odyssey that would span more than 6 decades and witness some of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in British political history. Churchill's early years in the House of Commons revealed both his extraordinary potential and his dangerous unpredictability. His maiden speech, delivered with characteristic confidence despite his persistent stutter, impressed even his political opponents with its eloquence and insight. However, his independent streak and willingness to challenge party orthodoxy quickly made him enemies within conservative ranks. When he crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party in 1904, citing his opposition to protectionist trade policies, many viewed it as naked opportunism rather than principled conviction. The Liberal landslide of 1906 catapulted Churchill into government as Undersecretary of State for the Colonies at the remarkably young age of 31. His rapid rise continued with appointments as President of the Board of Trade and later Home Secretary, positions that allowed him to champion progressive social reforms that seemed to contradict his aristocratic background. He worked alongside David Lloyd George to establish labor exchanges, unemployment insurance, and minimum wage legislation, reforms that laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. Yet even as Churchill burnished his credentials as a social reformer, darker aspects of his character began to emerge. As Home Secretary, he displayed an alarming enthusiasm for using military force against striking workers, most notably during the Tony Pandy riots in Wales. His decision to deploy troops against miners led to accusations that he was willing to turn British soldiers against British workers, a charge that would haunt him for decades. The incident revealed Churchill's instinctive authoritarianism and his tendency to view industrial disputes through a military lens. In 1911, Churchill achieved his long-cherished ambition of becoming First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. This appointment would prove to be both the making and nearly the breaking of his political career. Recognizing the growing threat posed by German naval expansion, Churchill threw himself into modernizing the fleet with characteristic energy and vision. He championed the development of naval aviation, pushed for the construction of faster, more heavily armed battleships, and worked tirelessly to ensure British naval supremacy. When war erupted in August 1914, Churchill was one of the few British politicians who seemed genuinely excited by the prospect of conflict. While others spoke gravely of duty and sacrifice, Churchill could barely contain his enthusiasm for what he saw as the greatest adventure of his lifetime. His energy and decisiveness in the early months of the war earned him widespread praise, but his impulsiveness and tendency toward grandiose schemes would soon lead to disaster. The Dardanelles Campaign of 1915 represented the nadir of Churchill's early political career and nearly destroyed his reputation permanently. Convinced that a naval assault on the Turkish Straits could knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia, Churchill pushed relentlessly for an operation that many naval and military experts viewed as impossibly risky. When the initial naval attack failed, he advocated for a land invasion that resulted in the catastrophic Gallipoli campaign. The human cost was staggering: over 250,000 Allied casualties, including thousands of young Australians and New Zealanders whose deaths would be laid at Churchill's door for generations to come. The strategic failure was equally devastating, as the operation not only failed to achieve its objectives, but also diverted crucial resources from other fronts. Churchill's role in the disaster made him a pariah within the government, and he was forced to resign from the Admiralty in May 1915. The fall from grace was swift and brutal. The man who had been hailed as one of Britain's most promising young politicians found himself relegated to the meaningless position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Unable to bear the humiliation and desperate to rehabilitate his reputation, Churchill made the extraordinary decision to resign from the government entirely and join his regiment on the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel commanding the 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers. Churchill's time in the trenches, though brief, provided him with first-hand experience of the horrors of modern warfare that would profoundly influence his later thinking. He shared the dangers and privations of his men, earning their respect through his courage under fire and his genuine concern for their welfare. Yet even in this darkest period of his career, his political ambitions never dimmed. He used his leave periods to lobby for his return to government, writing letters and making speeches that gradually began to restore his reputation. The Russian Revolution of 1917 provided Churchill with an opportunity to demonstrate his strategic vision and his unwavering opposition to Bolshevism. As Secretary of State for War and Air from 1919 to 1921, he became one of the most vocal advocates for military intervention against the Bolshevik regime. His passionate speeches warning of the dangers of communist ideology and his support for the White Russian forces revealed both his prescient understanding of the threat posed by totalitarianism and his tendency toward obsessive crusades that blinded him to practical realities. The intervention in Russia proved to be another costly failure, draining British resources and achieving little beyond prolonging a bloody civil war. Churchill's role in the affair reinforced his reputation for reckless adventurism and poor judgment, yet it also demonstrated his willingness to take unpopular stands when he believed fundamental principles were at stake. This pattern of being right about the big picture while being wrong about the details would characterize much of his political career. The Wilderness and the Gathering Storm. The 1920s and 1930s would prove to be the most challenging and transformative period of Churchill's long political career, a time when he would experience both his greatest failures and develop the insights that would make him the savior of Western civilization. These wilderness years, as they came to be known, saw Churchill marginalized from mainstream politics. Yet it was during this period of apparent decline that he would forge the moral clarity and strategic vision that would serve him so well when the world faced its darkest hour. Churchill's appointment as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924 under Stanley Baldwin's Conservative government seemed to mark his rehabilitation from the disasters of Gallipoli and the Russian intervention. Yet his tenure at the Treasury would prove to be another chapter in his catalog of well-intentioned failures. His decision to return Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate was an economic disaster that contributed to mass unemployment and industrial unrest throughout the decade. The policy, while supported by orthodox economic thinking of the time, demonstrated Churchill's fundamental misunderstanding of modern economics and his tendency to prioritize prestige over practical considerations. The overvalued pound made British exports uncompetitive, leading to factory closures and widespread hardship among the working classes. When the general strike erupted in 1926, Churchill's response revealed the authoritarian streak that had emerged during his time as Home Secretary. He advocated for the use of military force against strikers and edited a government propaganda newspaper that portrayed the strike as a revolutionary threat to constitutional government. These episodes reinforced Churchill's reputation as a man of poor judgment who could not be trusted with high office. His colleagues viewed him as brilliant but unstable, capable of inspiring rhetoric but prone to dangerous obsessions. When the Conservative government fell in 1929, Churchill found himself increasingly isolated within his own party, his views on economics, India, and rearmament placing him at odds with the prevailing consensus. It was during this period of political exile that Churchill began his most sustained and prescient campaign, his warnings about the rising threat of Nazi Germany. While most British politicians were focused on economic recovery and avoiding another catastrophic war, Churchill recognized that Adolf Hitler represented an existential threat to Western civilization. His speeches in Parliament and his articles in newspapers painted a stark picture of German rearmament and aggressive intentions that most of his contemporaries dismissed as warmongering. Churchill's warnings about Nazi Germany were informed by his deep study of history and his understanding of the dynamics of power. He recognized that Hitler's ideology was fundamentally different from traditional German nationalism, that it represented a revolutionary force that would not be satisfied with limited territorial gains or diplomatic concessions. His analysis of Mein Kampf and his conversations with German refugees provided him with insights into Nazi intentions that eluded most British intelligence analysts. Yet Churchill's credibility was undermined by his simultaneous campaign against Indian independence, which revealed the darker aspects of his imperial worldview. His speeches opposing the Government of India Act displayed a racial paternalism that was becoming increasingly anachronistic, and his warnings about the consequences of Indian self-rule proved largely unfounded. This campaign damaged his reputation among younger conservatives and reinforced perceptions that he was a relic of a bygone era. The personal cost of these wilderness years was enormous. Churchill suffered from what he called his black dog, periods of severe depression that left him unable to work or socialize. His financial situation was precarious, dependent on his writing and journalism to maintain his expensive lifestyle. His marriage to Clementine, while fundamentally strong, was strained by his political failures and his tendency to become obsessed with lost causes. During this period, Churchill threw himself into writing with unprecedented intensity, producing a massive biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and beginning work on his history of the English-speaking peoples. These literary endeavors served both as a source of income and as a means of working through his understanding of leadership, strategy, and the forces that shape history. His writing revealed a romantic view of great men and decisive moments that would influence his approach to the coming war. The Munich Agreement of 1938 represented both the vindication of Churchill's warnings and the nadir of his political influence. While Neville Chamberlain was hailed as a peacemaker for his negotiations with Hitler, Churchill delivered one of his most powerful speeches, declaring that Britain had sustained a total and unmitigated defeat, and warning that this was only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom. The speech was met with hostility from most members of Parliament, who viewed Churchill as a warmonger, undermining the government's efforts to preserve peace. Yet within months, Hitler's occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia would prove Churchill's analysis correct and begin the process of his rehabilitation. The man who had been dismissed as a dangerous anachronism was slowly being recognized as a prophet whose warnings had been tragically accurate. As Europe moved inexorably toward war in 1939, Churchill's long years in the wilderness began to bear fruit. His consistent warnings about Nazi intentions, his detailed knowledge of German rearmament, and his understanding of modern warfare made him an increasingly valuable voice in British politics. When war finally came in September 1939, there was only one man who possessed both the moral authority and the strategic vision to lead Britain through its greatest trial. The finest hour and eternal legacy. When Neville Chamberlain's government collapsed in May 1940, following the disastrous Norwegian campaign, Winston Churchill finally achieved the position he had coveted for decades, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Yet he assumed power at the darkest moment in British history, with Nazi armies sweeping across Western Europe and the very survival of democracy hanging in the balance. The man who had been dismissed as a dangerous relic would now have the opportunity to prove that his warnings had been prophetic and his vision of leadership was exactly what the hour demanded. Churchill's first speech as Prime Minister to the House of Commons on May 13, 1940, set the tone for everything that would follow. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he declared, promising a fight to the death against Nazi tyranny. These words, delivered with his characteristic growl and accompanied by his famous V for Victory gesture, galvanized a nation that had been demoralized by months of military defeats and political uncertainty. The evacuation from Dunkirk, which began just days after Churchill took office, presented him with his first major test as wartime leader. While the military situation was catastrophic, the entire British expeditionary force trapped on a French beach with German armies closing in, Churchill recognized the propaganda value of what could be portrayed as a miraculous deliverance. His speeches transformed a military disaster into a symbol of British resilience and determination, coining phrases like, "We shall never surrender," that would echo through history. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England during the summer and autumn of 1940, represented Churchill's finest hour as both strategist and inspirational leader. His decision to prioritize fighter production over bombers, his support for radar development, and his understanding of the crucial importance of pilot training all contributed to the RAF's narrow victory over the Luftwaffe. His tribute to the few, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, captured the nation's gratitude and admiration for the young pilots who had saved Britain from invasion. Yet Churchill's leadership during this period was not without controversy. His decision to continue fighting after the fall of France, when many in his own government favored seeking terms with Hitler, was seen by some as recklessly endangering the British people. His order to sink the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir, killing over 1,200 French sailors to prevent the ships from falling into German hands, demonstrated his willingness to make the hardest decisions when national survival was at stake. The Blitz, which began in September 1940, tested Churchill's leadership in new ways. His decision to remain in London throughout the bombing, touring devastated neighborhoods, and sharing the dangers faced by ordinary citizens made him a symbol of British defiance. His appearances in the underground stations where Londoners sheltered from the bombs, his tears at the destruction of the House of Commons, and his visible anger at the suffering of civilians all contributed to his image as a leader who truly shared his people's trials. Churchill's greatest strategic achievement was his success in bringing the United States into the war. His relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, cultivated through hundreds of personal letters and face-to-face meetings, gradually drew America from neutrality to full partnership in the fight against fascism. The Atlantic Charter, the Lend-Lease program, and ultimately the American entry into the war following Pearl Harbor all bore the mark of Churchill's diplomatic skill and strategic vision. The wartime conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam revealed both Churchill's strengths and limitations as a global statesman. His understanding of the Soviet threat and his warnings about Stalin's post-war intentions proved remarkably prescient, yet his inability to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe highlighted the limits of British power in the New World Order. His famous Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri in 1946 helped define the Cold War struggle that would dominate the next 4 decades. Churchill's electoral defeat in 1945, just months after leading Britain to victory, was a devastating personal blow that he never fully understood. The British people, while grateful for his wartime leadership, were ready for social change and domestic reform that Churchill and the Conservative Party seemed unable to provide. His final years as Prime Minister, from 1951 to 1955, were marked by declining health and a growing sense that the world had moved beyond his Victorian certainties. The personal cost of Churchill's extraordinary career was enormous. His relationship with his children was often strained by his political obsessions and his demanding personality. His son Randolph struggled with alcoholism and never escaped his father's shadow, while his daughters often felt neglected and overshadowed by their father's public persona. Clementine Churchill bore the burden of managing a household and family while her husband pursued his destiny, often at great personal sacrifice. Churchill's legacy remains complex and contested. His role as the savior of democracy during World War II is unquestioned, yet his views on empire, race, and social change reflected the prejudices of his time and class. His warnings about Soviet communism proved accurate, but his romantic view of empire and his resistance to decolonization placed him on the wrong side of history. His literary achievements, including his Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, demonstrated his gifts as a writer and historian, yet his tendency towards self-aggrandizement and myth-making sometimes obscured the truth. Perhaps Churchill's greatest legacy lies not in any particular policy or decision, but in his demonstration that individual leadership can make a decisive difference in history. At a moment when the forces of darkness seemed overwhelming, when democracy appeared weak and divided, Churchill showed that courage, determination, and moral clarity could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. His life reminds us that history is not inevitable, that the choices made by individuals in moments of crisis can determine the fate of civilizations. As we reflect on Churchill's extraordinary journey from troubled child to savior of the free world, we are reminded that greatness often emerges from struggle, that the very qualities that make someone difficult and controversial may also make them indispensable when crisis strikes. Churchill's story is ultimately one of redemption, of a flawed human being who found his purpose in defending the values and freedoms that define our civilization. What aspects of Churchill's complex legacy do you find most compelling or troubling? How do you think his example of leadership applies to the challenges facing democracy today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Icons of History for more in-depth explorations of the fascinating figures who shaped our world.